We're very lucky. I mean, what a turnout. Brilliant. It's a great turnout for an absolutely amazing person. I first went to St Peter's and heard you talk about Brexit, the book Rule Britannia. Yeah, and there was a capacity crowd there. And I think I got picked to ask a question, which I was quite nervous about, but anyway. And then I went to Blackwell's to hear you talk about this new book. He's written about a dozen books, The Shattered Nation, and Inequality and the Geography of a Failing State. Now, Danny doesn't deal in politics, but he does deal in data and facts, and often, what he says is definitely resonates. And he's going to talk here about Oxford. And what is? I thought the question might be, what is a social geographer? But I'll leave you with that one. And first of all, though, welcome Anthony Khan, who's just going to talk about Donington Doorstep. There is a connection between the two. Okay, so Anthony.
Shall I take it away?
Yeah, take it over.
Hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. I guess I'll stand there so you can see me. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you're all right.
I'm all right to stand, I'm better on my feet anyway. I'm the youth club manager for Donington Doorstep, which was founded in 1984, I believe, with the help and support of Danny's mum and a group of other really incredibly powerful women who just so happen to be mums. This year it will be 40 years since it's been running and functioning, providing services to the wider community, and we are looking, I guess, this year to try and expand the services that we provide to our community. I had a very positive meeting with the management team this morning, and basically the only way that we can do it is with further support from the wider community to be able to continue these amazing services that we've been providing. I don't want to say too much, I guess, or waffle on too much, but I am really happy and proud to say that it has a long-standing legacy, and proud to be part of the team that's actually made substantial changes in many people's lives and families across OX4 region, and we still continue to provide amazing services for the local families. And yeah, I guess I'm just going to hand it over to Danny, who can do the social geography side of stuff. Keep it nice and yeah, we can swap.
Thank you for coming. It's slightly disconcerting speaking here because there are people here who know my mum, which doesn't normally happen when I speak publicly. And I was going to read out this thing, which is almost unreadable. My mum was only involved in some advice at the beginning of Donington Doorstep. She worked in playgroups. She might have been the regional lead of the Preschool Playgroup Association. Playgroups were an enormous thing in the 60s, bigger in the 70s. Donington needed a second one. The waiting list was enormous. The playgroups were needed for the mothers, primarily, not for the children. That's what they realised. I'm partly not reading it out, partly because it's not easy to read the letter the speech she gave when Donington Doorstep was opened, but partly because it talks about how difficult it was having an overactive toddler. Me, and three other boys under 6, at a time when you are trapped in your house in Oxford. This is Churchill Road, just next to County Centre. At that time, we moved to Risinghurst. My mum becomes a do-gooder, so she's one of the do-gooders by the time Donington's Doorstep is being created. But it's an incredible story, and this is one of the sort of sad things if you reflect now. A group of women came together, raised the money, got £12,000, got the terrapin shipped in, got everybody to do the work, and built it. Right, this isn't the kind of thing that happens anymore. What happens now is you keep it going, you don't imagine building a new one, and you raise money for food banks, which of course we didn't have to do back then. So this is going to get a bit depressing, and I'll just be half an hour, because the most interesting thing is what you've got to say, and I'll try and lift it up towards the end. We often wondered what would happen, if you can remember 1979, what would happen if 1979 never ended? 1979 was kind of like when Narnia turned cold and the Wicked Witch came in and all the animals were frozen. And mass unemployment began. And the very last jobs, the jobs in the car factory, the new ones didn't start. My year at school was the last year when the boys were taken on to work in the car factory. That's what most of them did from my school. And it was the last time. And we wondered, what happens if it doesn't end? What happens if that inequality that began in the 1980s, which rose and rose and rose and rose, doesn't come down again? What occurs? And this is it. And it looks quite nice. This is Oxford. You can think, well, it's all okay. So I will depress you a little bit about things. Of course, this is an affluent city in a poor country. We now have the highest income inequality rate in all of Europe, give or take Bulgaria. We've almost certainly beaten Bulgaria, but they're late with their numbers. The poorest fifth of people in the UK are now poorer than the poorest fifth in the majority of Eastern Europe. And the statistics keep on getting worse. Is there a bit of cloth that I pass that's going round somewhere?
Yeah, I've got it.
You've got it. Keep passing it round. This is an experiment to see if this works. So there are no slides, but that is 150 diagrams that would have been in the Shattered Britain book if the publisher had let me have diagrams. It kind of proves there's lots of data. You can open it up and have a look. Don't worry about hurting it. This is all based on numbers. I can go through the statistics about the UK. What's interesting about Oxford, and Atlas of Inequality was published in 2019, and Oxford is just about the only city in the country that has people from every income decile in it. So there are representatives of the best of 10th of people in the city. That is mainly North Oxford and Parktown and so on, but a little bit here. A little bit in Headington. Then representatives from decile 9, almost as well off as decile 10, decile 7, decile 6, the same proportion. Right down to the poorest tenth of people in the country. And you don't get that in general. In general, what you get is an area that's either poorer or is pretty rich, like Kensington and so on. Not this kind of division. When I was 6, we moved from here. I can remember going to Iffley Lock as a child. We moved from here to Risinghurst because there were 6 boys. You can't have 6 boys. Well, not if you're middle class. You can't have 6 boys in a 3-bed house. And I grew up on the Green Road roundabout, which still has one of the widest social differentials around it. So a social geographer is somebody who is interested in the inequalities in society. And I was interested in inequalities in society because I happened to grow up in a very unequal part of the country. And you're aware of this as a child. You're aware that what determines what children go on to do isn't whether they're clever or hardworking at school, it is simply which way they walk to school. That told you what they were going to do, or of course what school they go to. But Oxford, in the 1970s, early 1980s, was the most equal it had ever been. We had just desegregated the school system. We got rid of the grammars. I would have failed the 11 plus. Of course, what would have happened to me is what used to happen. My father's a doctor. If I failed the 11 plus, I'd been straight into modelling. Back then, you might think not nowadays, but back then I would. We partly desegregated our schools because the middle class couldn't necessarily afford modelling anymore and didn't want their children going to secondary models. But anyway, for the first time ever, most of the children of Oxford went to the same school. And what they did originally is just go to the nearest school. Because what else do you do? And that was my childhood. We had full employment. We had well-paid jobs. You could get married. You could start a family in your mid-20s. You could have holidays. 1 in 3 children no longer has a summer holiday, not for a week anymore in England. But we're in Oxford, so does it matter? This is the interesting question. What is the effect on a place that's winning? This isn't a northern town. This isn't a poorer southern town. This isn't an inner borough of London. It's possibly the most expensive city between here and San Francisco going in one direction and here in San Francisco going in the other direction. What do you get? What happens? Well, the first thing you get is less and less children and less young adults, right? You've proven this to me tonight. Have a look around. Okay? But you don't need me just to assert it, it's in the census data. You can see that the kind of Pied Piper of Hamelin has come to Oxford and taken the children away. 2019, there were less than 1,000 children taking their GCSEs in the state schools in the city. That's the kind of status. When people with children can't be in this city, you can't have children in this city. Why does that matter? Because there used to be a group a century ago who couldn't have children. That was the group which all the women in this audience would be the most likely to join, which was working in service. And if you became a servant, you couldn't have children, which is one of the reasons people hated working in service. But in effect, people are working in service again. There are people in this city who can survive here, can live here, can get a bed here. They're your primary school teachers, your secondary school teachers. They're sharing houses like students used to. But they can't have children. Now you might think, oh, well, it's Oxford, it's special, and we've got to be number 1 in the world, haven't we? So that's okay, we're going to be a research hotel. It'll work. But things begin to fall apart. And the problem is that you get used to them falling apart, so you don't see what it is that you're losing. You get used to the fact it's incredibly hard to recruit people to certain jobs. You get used to the fact that the buses keep breaking down. If you've ever wondered why, when you're sitting on the bus from London and it breaks down and pulls into the side, another bus normally comes and picks you up. But why are the buses breaking down? That's because you can't afford the mechanics, because the mechanics can't afford to live here. We are supposedly getting 180 electric double-decker buses, which is brilliant. We may be the first fully electric bus city in England. But the problem's the drivers. The irony, the great irony for me, I was born in 68, I left here in 86, I came back 11 years ago, is to find university associate professors on salaries of 60, 70, 80 or 90,000 pounds, desperately trying to buy the homes of car workers. And with a little bit of family money, or quite a lot of family money, say 100 or 150 grand, you might be able to buy one of the nicer, larger 3 beds in Florence Park. It's not the same, though, as the houses that the car workers lived in. And there were up to 40,000 car workers, mostly men, mostly with wives, with children. It was a different city. It's not the same house because it's 40 years older and more dilapidated and cost a fortune. But you feel so lucky you've managed to do it that some people can. But that is the associate professors in the university. And they are only a tenth of the staff of what keeps the university going. I shouldn't really care about the university because I grew up here. And if you grow up here, you may know you really, really don't like the university. But I work for it now. And the 2 universities and the hospitals and a few other things are really the only game in town. one nice thing that's happened to Oxford is that the old reasons for animosity, which were absolute fear of the Stokes and the Weasels over there, Winds and Willows and Essentials based on this city. In fact, almost every children's book was based on this city. But that animosity, the nastiness, the reason why Magdalen College built a moat around it in the 80s, and the burst of moat because of the raping local children, which is a bit insulting if you're one of them. The reason why they built a moat around Magdalen, the reason why they took away the bridges and all the other routes that there were across the city was fear. And the fear was understandable, particularly in the 80s. Because you've got a city full of car workers and their children, and particularly their sons. And Paul Market was ours, and the High Street was ours, and a lot was ours, and you hide in the JCR and you occasionally come out, and if you're in your frock coat, you're in trouble, which didn't create a particularly good socialisation for those two young men when I was 16. You can see where that came from now. If the town decides not to be particularly nice to one part of it, it's actually not being nice to people who work in the middle of the town for the university. The example I'll give you is what happened last summer. Last summer, the private schools were on holiday. You know when that happens, the private schools, a third of our kids go private. Private schools go on holiday, all these cars off the road, Tuscany's full. Signs put up at the cycleway crossing over into Marston, saying that the bridges will be closed on August the 10th, I think it is, for 10 weeks. Now, there are only about 4 ways across that river. There's the 1,000-year-old bridge, okay? There's the ring road, there's further south, and there's that little cycleway that goes across. Now, the problem of saying you're going to close that cycleway, where the land is owned by the university, although operated by the county council, although involving a private firm owned by French billionaires who live on an island in the Caribbean. The problem of saying you're going to close that cycleway for 10 weeks from August the 10th is it'll be closed when the schools start. And there are still children in the city. And they cycle to school, many of them. And they cycle that way. They cycle across from all over the city to get to the Swan, which is the new school, the first new school in 50 years. They cycle the other way to get to Magdalen because their parents don't want them cycling over the second most dangerous roundabout in the south of England, which is the Plain, where 3 members of university staff were killed in the 2 years before the university made a decision to close the only safe route. And they produce a plan that says, oh, don't worry, you can go around the Plain, or you can cycle all the way up to the ring road and round again to get to school. Right. Now, why did they do that? Apart from incompetence. They did it because in the past you would do it because East Oxford was full of those other children who didn't matter. But East Oxford wasn't full of those other children anymore. Half of the children cycling across those cycle bridges were wearing little sooty uniforms, right, for the schools that cost a lot of money to go to. And I welcomed it. There's a kind of desegregation of the city going on. The short story of what happened eventually was that almost just a day before the schools went back, they decided that there was going to be a route you could actually go that didn't involve your child on their first day at secondary school having to cycle around the Plain. And that's the kind of stupidity that happens nowadays and is utterly unnecessary. We really should have a whole set of routes across this river. It should be a safe cycling city. You shouldn't worry about where your child goes to school in this city and how they're going to get there. There's no need for this city to be dangerous. We should be able to organise ourselves. Ideally, we should be able to do things like build Donington Doorsteps again. But we shouldn't be in this kind of paralysis where if somebody comes up with some traffic scheme, it becomes the biggest news story on the planet. It was broadcast on Australian TV. You shouldn't need the chief druid coming from Stonehenge asserting the rights of people to be able to get to celebrate the solstice and worried that the city of Oxford is going to cut them off if you know that story. You shouldn't have Lawrence Fox addressing 2,000 people in Broad Street, or Piers Corbyn. You've come a long, long way down from a city that did things like set up hundreds of halfway houses for people leaving community psychiatric hospitals, set up Oxfam, and all kinds of other things. A long way down to not even be able to rationally discuss the traffic scheme so you can find a way of fitting your 180 electric buses in. And 180 electric buses, by the way, are not for people with cargo bikes, because you can't get a cargo bike onto a bus. But anyway, I'm just trying to wind people up. I did promise half an hour, so I will speed up. The schools are a mess. The schools are a mess. The divisions between the schools are a mess. I challenge you to find me another city in Europe with this wider division, segregation of its children. With this amount of fear amongst its parents when the allocations of primary schools come out about what might happen to their children. With people willing to pay this much money to move away from where most of the babies are born in the city, which is down this way towards the southeast, and move their children up and up, desperately trying to get into a couple of schools which still get worse GCSE results than the 6 best schools in Sheffield. And those are the posh comprehensives. We shouldn't necessarily have so many children from abroad whose parents are paying £50,000 for the 7 international schools. We should at least keep an eye on what the earth's going on to them. It's an incredibly segregated city. And it doesn't produce the most educated children in the world somehow. We can test the ability of young adults by the age of 24, and we find of all of Europe, the ones who can't actually do maths, despite having an A grade at it at age 16, who can't problem solve as well, and certainly, of course, we don't have the literary skills of anywhere else in Europe, but you might have an A grade in French. It's not the same. And you actually find that our children are not brilliantly educated. You could do the same for our universities and actually see how able the graduates are at 24. Anyway, I could get in trouble for doing that. Because, of course, we produce the brightest and cleverest on the planet, that kind of fact. So, and it begins to get embarrassing in a country that is falling apart. The extremes of it nationally. The last 2 years we've seen the biggest rise in infant mortality and mortality for children between age 1 and 4. Nothing to do with a pandemic rebound. If you think of that little boy in Skegness, where his death was revealed on the 16th of January, who died curled up starving next to his father, who had a heart attack at 60. Nobody asked, why did the dad have a heart attack at 60? Why do we have illness rates of people in their 60s so high? At least they did ask. Why did the little boy starve to death in Skegness? What they don't say is there are areas of Oxford where the poverty rates in Skegness. At least in Skegness, a social worker on £24,000 a year can afford to live. Whereas how do you get your competent social workers to stay any length of time in Oxford? It could happen here. And they don't say that when we look at the average heights of our children, they've been falling since the children born in 2005. So the children are getting shorter now. The only other place in Europe where we record that is in Germany for a couple of years when they let in 1.5 million Syrians, including roughly half of them children, and children coming out of a war zone tend to be shorter. The national stats are awful, but let's go back to this city, because you can get an impression that everything works here, sort of works. because it's changed every year gradually. Now, you mentioned the women who sat at Donington Doorstep. It wasn't just Donington Doorstep. Apologies to the older men in the room, and you can correct me later. But I've been quietly working my way through the committees of the 1970s and 80s, who started the Quarry Play Scheme, who got East Oxford Community Centre going, who did this. It was all women. Might be the first time women were actually being able or empowered or felt they could or did, but the city was transformed largely by women doing things, pushing things. And it wasn't just what they did, it was what they didn't allow to happen. It was the attitudes that said we are going to make sure that we have a decent playgroup provision. The attitudes that said that the schools need to be good enough and need to work. It was a whole series of attitudes back then. And it's flipped and it's changed. The city I left in the 1980s, all the wards that fed the car works were Labour, and you recognise the names of the councillors, and often they worked in the car works. And Labour met in County Workers' Social Club. I come back, and I find there's a by-election in North Oxford, and it's red and green. What kind of a planet is this? And the Labour Party now meet at a church in Summertown. What's happened? Right? And it happened slowly, and it happened gradually. But it's very different. And then I asked, where are the houses? Because I'd lived in Sheffield and been next to Doncaster, and lived in Leeds, and even Bristol. And everywhere I'd lived when I left Oxford, they'd built some houses. Right? Often quite a lot of houses. So I come back. I haven't built anything. Nothing. The last housing was on the edge of Risinghurst when I left it. There's a little project to build a thing called Barton Park, which is going to have a lot of council houses in it, but then in the end didn't, and now got some penthouses at the top of it. And there's something else happening. Nothing. Was it that you don't need houses? Do you not need the people who are going to be in the houses? Can they just drive in from Birmingham? 40,000 a day driving in over the green belt before the pandemic hit. The least green belt in the world, with that amount of carbon being emitted by all those cars, and people have to drive over the green belt because we have a green belt, because we don't want the people who service the city to be allowed to live anywhere near us. What was the other complaint? Now, microaggressions. I'm stopping in less than 5 minutes. Little things. Yeah, over the cycle path. Of course, people ignored the rule that said you couldn't cycle in the summer. Of course they did. But somebody wanted to complain about all the Deliveroo cyclists. It was terrible. The Deliveroo cyclists, they're cycling this way. You know, they shouldn't. It's dangerous. Why do you think we have Deliveroo cyclists? Who is it that they're taking the pizza to? What is this group of people doing? Where do they sleep? Those kind of questions. The kind of questions you didn't ask in the 1920s or 1930s. The kind of question that Sebastian didn't ask of his servant in Brideshead Revisited. Right? But that world we got away from. But the world you're going back to now. Why does it matter? Why be bothered if you're in an affluent, successful city with a university raking in money from philanthropists, some of the most pleasant people on the planet? That's a diplomatic way of putting it, isn't it? No, I can't get in trouble for that. None of them can sue me if I say a lovely bunch of men. Why worry about it? Well, you become a university that is reliant on people with money, that is reliant on postgraduate students in the main and not undergraduates who can pay very high fees. You become reliant on Heathrow Airport, which is the vital connection route if you've got students who need, for various social reasons, to fly many times a year home or to parties. You're not actually that green a university. You can put solar panels on the roof and heat pumps in the garden at Wolfson, but just don't ask about the flying. But it's dangerous as well, because what happens one day if the fashion for coming to get a degree here goes? What happens if you're utterly reliant on the money of international students for getting a degree? It's not a safe model. It's less safe than relying on a particular kind of car being built by Leyland, and look at the model, which didn't work. But if you need a personal reason to worry, and it's going to happen to all of us, it's different from worrying about Bronson and the infant mortality figures and the fact that they've gone at the fastest ever recorded in the last 2 years. We're all going to hopefully end up in hospital. It's so hopefully, because the other thing is rather quick and a bit early. Right? We're all going to end up in hospitals. We've got a lot of hospitals here, but they're falling apart. Story just to end on. Then think of your questions. If you do short questions, I promise short answers, and it'll be more fun than hearing me waffle. I like kayaking. Nicest thing about this city are the rivers, so many of them. Let's have an inflatable kayak. I go with friends, normally with women, which I need to tell you because otherwise this story would sound really strange. And I always have a spare paddle and a spare seat. And I always invite anybody on the bank to come in, which may seem a bit weird. And there was a lass up at the steps at Cutterslow, looking a bit bewildered. And so I said, do you want to come in with us? And normally most people are sane, and they don't say yes to a strange man offering to put him in a kayak. Anyway, she said yes, and I said, what are you doing? She said, I'm working at the John Radcliffe, I'm a nurse. And I said, where are you from? She said, Lagos. And then I said, can you swim? She said, no. Then I made a judgment call. It's only about 5 foot high, and there's 2 of us, and my young female colleague is much fitter than me and could get her out. And then I said, have you ever been on the river before? And she said, no. I thought, this is fun. I said, have you ever been to London? She said, no. I said, how long have you been in Oxford? She said, 18 months. I said, what do you do? She said, I come down and walk by the river. And you're not working in the John Radcliffe. But the family are ever so proud in Lagos that we fly nurses from Lagos in. And then she said the sweetest thing. The river was absolutely dirty brown, full of the stuff. It's from the fields, it's not what we had. But the Oxford sewer, by the way, is going. I mean, that's different. Because you can't put that many people into a city and expect the sewer to work. The river was incredibly brown because it had rained a lot and all the soil had come off. And she goes, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Well, I don't get it, you know, even the charwell full of mud to somebody is beautiful. But the point of this story is that we've got to the point of flying people in from abroad and holding on to them for just about long enough until they can tell their family that they're really, really lonely and upset, and that this wonderful town that everybody knows the name of in the world isn't quite as great as it was made up to be. But then the HR person will find another bunch of women to put on another plane, and we can keep the hospital going. And that's who, if I stay here and you, that's who's going to be looking after us in our last 3-4 months of life in these hospitals. Right? So if you just want a selfish reason to think we need some schools that work, some housing that operates, a bus system where the buses move like they move in North London, just 20 miles an hour, just get you there. Simple things, not trams, not that kind of fantasy that every single one of our twin cities in Europe has. Not the kind of student accommodation they have in Finland, not the housing system they got in Vienna, not the bus tickets you can buy in Germany, nothing of that, just you know, what people in other European countries had a decade or 2 ago. We've got to do something about it, otherwise we slowly become more and more like an elite American university town, which is a segregated bipolar society with some winners and the majority of losers, and people increasingly more and more frightened of each other and other people getting their space or doing something that might spoil their view so they can't sell their house for £1 million and bail their own children out in the future. We just become more and more scared of each other. And that is the danger of what's happening here in the city, I think. It's divided politically. You probably know at the moment. It's been really interesting to watch it. I'm just trying to stir up at this point for questions. I like it very much. I think I'm very lucky to be back. I think the university is changing, but still so slowly. I hate watching the way in which normal human beings who are appointed to academic posts at a university where suddenly you're a trustee of a college and you in fact own part of it, are slowly transformed into the kind of people you grew up not liking. It's an interesting sociological experiment to watch how it happens, but it isn't necessary anymore. The University of Oxford no longer hires its own graduates to be its dons, right? It can't, because somebody is watching from outside and really you've got to look a little bit good. So people come in from all over the place, which is great. But they come in still. What was I told when I came? Well, I will stop, because I've gone 2 minutes over. The person hiring me didn't know I grew up here. So they said to me, it's lovely, it's brilliant, houses are a bit expensive, but the real problem is the schools. But don't worry, there's a European school, which I'd never heard of. And obviously you'll want your children to go there because you're a bit left-wing and officially it's a state school. Right? Now, I've seen that in other northern cities. If you go to Newcastle still, you're told to live in Jesmond. It's colonial White Highland kind of game. But it's quite odd for it to happen to you. And particularly when these schools that they are avoiding aren't the schools I went to then. These are schools where half the children are going to university if they want. And most of them, you don't have to go to university. In fact, you can earn far more if you don't. But most of the children who are going to university from most of the state schools in Oxford are going to exactly the same universities that the people who are paying private are getting their children into. Why are they doing it? And on that, now, when I was young, I told you I'd have been chucked into Magdalen if we had the 11 plus. When I was young, if I'd gone to Magdalen, I'd be 20 times more likely to go to university than if I went to Cheney, and I went to Cheney. Now, if you're 20 times more likely, it's worth paying the money, isn't it? I mean, that is a game changer. And back then, whatever it was, the 7 or 8% of us went to university, we were set for life. I mean, you really had to make a big mistake for things not to go well for you if you were a graduate from my age. Let alone my parents, let alone my grandparents, because I've been told off for saying this, but I am posh. Right? Why do they do it now? What are you buying? Safety? It's not that safe from drugs in schools where parents have got a lot of money. Safety from meeting somebody you don't want them to meet, maybe? Fear? What is it? What is it that's going on? And you can feel it. I can say it to you because you're an older, well, I don't know, you might get upset, but you're an older crowd. I could not say this to an audience 10 years younger than me because it's too near the bone in this city. It affects where people live, what they do. And I think that's the saddest thing. You know, in that there is this fear of other people in a city with absolutely no need to have this fear of other people. It's not the Brideshead Revisited time and the men have just turned up from the Welsh coalfields kind of difference anymore. Good things happening. I promise you positive. I quite like the traffic schemes, at least we're doing them. I like the cycle paths that have been painted on pavements, you take them for granted. They were new. We could do a bit more than that, but it's kind of like better than nothing. What I've learned to like in 10 years, or become a lot less chippy about, is I quite like the new people moving in. I like the Americans who live in Florence Park now, with their guitars. You can find them in the pub, some of you may know who they are, creating new communities, trying to create a social life. Tomorrow night I'm at a meeting about why, of the 61 university towns in England, does Oxford rank 61st for worst nightlife? Now, somebody has to, okay? But anyway, and that's the Americans want an answer to that, right? And in a way, these new communities coming in, by community I mean people who just hopefully stay for 10 years. It's just like what has always happened in Oxford. It's always been migrants coming in. That's what a car town is about. So that is good. There are other good things happening, but there is this wish not to alter anything that is harder and harder to defend when what you have is not necessarily that precious anymore. It looks lovely. You don't want to spoil views and things, particularly when your main asset is that in a Europe where the rest of Europe is getting remarkably richer compared to us, we're a cheap tourist destination. You might not like them, but they are money. You don't want to spoil the views, but this is the largest town between London and Birmingham, and it is tiny, and it has been constrained in a particular way, I think, for the fantasies of a series of senior ministers, government ministers, prime ministers, and permanent secretaries, who, the rudest way I put it, let's do it, I'll get told off, because they all lost their virginity here. Which is why it mustn't ever change. No, so did I. Okay? I won't tell you where, it was in Oxford. But that doesn't mean that that particular spot of South Park needs Oxford. Anyway, I'll shut up. Please ask me questions. Please keep them short. We're going to have a compare, and I'll keep my answers short.